call the cops. He's on a jet ski in a lake he owns. That's the level of absurdity I was dealing with when the HOA president decided to summon the authorities because I dared to enjoy my own water. Somewhere between planting petunias and fussing over mailbox heights, she had apparently crowned herself the admiral of neighborhood lakes. 3 patrol cars, a bewildered deputy, and a woman shouting community resource violation later. My weekend had taken a turn I never anticipated. And believe me, it didn't end there. She had binoculars, a noise level chart, and something that looked suspiciously like a mood board dedicated to my shoreline. What unfolded was part courtroom drama, part stand-up routine, and all ho nonsense. Ever had a neighbor who thought property lines didn't matter? Let me know below because the story might just outdo yours. Moving to my grandfather's ranch was supposed to be the start of a simpler life. After a decade of coding software in a cramped city apartment, inheriting 180 acres of Texas countryside felt like hitting the jackpot. Sure, the old farmhouse needed work, but the real treasure was the lake right in the middle of it all. My grandfather had been sipping his coffee beside it since 1987. The HOA neighborhood that butted up against my land hadn't even been built until after 2010, long after Grandpa had staked his morning coffee claim by the water. My first week was spent roaming the property lines, checking fences, and getting a feel for my new domain. The deed was crystal clear: 180 acres, including all natural water features and mineral rights. But the moment I saw that lake shimmering in the afternoon sun, I knew exactly how I'd spend my weekends. So that Friday, I headed into town and bought a bright blue jet ski. Nothing fancy, just something sturdy that promised a few peaceful hours on the water. When I told the clerk I owned the lake, he was impressed. Honestly, so was I. Saturday morning, I was up at dawn, skimming across the water for the first time. It was incredibly pure freedom, just the hum of the engine and the wind in my face. I must have spent 3 hours out there, relishing the fact that this was all mine. No crowds, no fees, no rules, just the ones I set myself. Eventually, I pulled back to shore and noticed a woman standing at the edge of my property, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. She looked to be in her late 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a cardigan that had seen better days. She waved at me with what seemed like a friendly smile, so I shut off the engine and walked over. "Beautiful lake you've got," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Knight, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I live just over there." She gestured toward a house about 200 yards away, clearly inside the HOA development. "I wanted to come by and introduce myself and welcome you to the neighborhood." Her smile seemed genuine, but there was something in her eyes that made me wary. "We have some community guidelines about noise, especially on weekends," she continued. "I'm sure you understand how sound travels across water. We like to keep things peaceful for everyone." I felt my jaw clench slightly, but kept my tone friendly. "I appreciate you stopping by, Mrs. Knight," I said. "But this is private ranch property. I'm not part of your HOA." Her smile faltered for just a split second before she recovered. "Oh, I know that," she said quickly. "But we're all neighbors here, right? We should be considerate of one another." I pulled the folded deed from my pocket and showed it to her. "This lake has been in my family since 1987, I explained. "Long before your neighborhood was even on the map. I understand wanting things to be quiet, but I have every right to enjoy my own property." She glanced at the deed, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, and maybe frustration, maybe even anger. Of course," she said, stepping back slightly. "I just thought you'd want to be a good neighbor." With that, she turned and walked back to her HOA development, leaving me with an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I spent the rest of the day replaying our conversation. Something about Victoria Knight didn't sit right with me, though I couldn't say exactly what it was. Maybe she was just overly protective of her neighborhood, or maybe she was the sort of person who needed to control everything around her. Either way, I wasn't about to let someone else tell me what I could or couldn't do on my own land. As the sun sank over the lake, I took the jet ski out one more time, doing a victory lap around the entire shoreline. This was my land, my lake, my life. If Mrs. Knight had a problem, she could take it up with the deed office. But as I was loading the jet ski back onto the trailer, I noticed Victoria watching me from her kitchen window with a pair of binoculars. The friendly neighbor routine was already slipping away, and something told me this was just the start of what was going to be a very long battle. Little did I know that while I was enjoying a quiet evening by the lake, Victoria was already at her old laptop, typing into an internet search bar, "How to stop neighbor noise legal." I had no idea that the war had already begun. Monday morning brought an unwelcome surprise in my mailbox. A handwritten letter, 3 pages long, complete with the official letterhead of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The envelope was addressed to occupant of 123 Ranch Road in Victoria. Knight's meticulous script. I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly note. The letter accused me of excessive noise pollution and demanded I cease all motorized activity or face legal consequences. It was even signed with her own fake seal, as if she ran her own mini-government. The sheer nerve of it was mind-blowing. But what really got to me was how official she was trying to make it sound, throwing around legal jargon and making threats like she had real authority over my land. I decided I needed to talk to someone who had been here longer than I had, someone who might know how to handle this sort of nonsense. My nearest neighbor outside the HOA was Olivia Harrington, a kind woman in her 50s who lived in an old farmhouse about half a mile down the road. Olivia had been in the area for over 20 years and had watched the HOA development grow from nothing. When I showed her Victoria's letter, she let out a long sigh and shook her head. "Oh honey, she's not the first person Victoria's gone after," Olivia said, pouring us both some iced tea. "She's made life miserable for at least 4 families I know of. People have moved away because she kept calling the police over barking dogs in the middle of the afternoon. Others had to build tall fences after she complained that their kids' playground was an eyesore visible from her kitchen window." Olivia explained that Victoria had taken over as HOA president about 2 years ago, after convincing the previous president to step down. Since then, things had only gotten worse. "She's been even more difficult since her divorce," Olivia added. "She lost her job at the bank after some conflict with co-workers, and now being HOA president is basically her full-time job. She runs it like she's the ruler of a small country." As Olivia spoke, the picture became clearer. Victoria Knight wasn't just a concerned neighbor, she was someone who needed to control everything around her. And my private lake had become her next obsession. "The thing is," Olivia said, "she's clever about it. She knows just enough about local laws and procedures to make people's lives miserable, even when she has no real authority." I drove home that evening with a much better understanding of the challenge ahead. This wasn't going to be settled with a polite chat or by flashing my property deed again. Victoria was going to push until one of us gave in, and I had zero plans to surrender my rights to my land. That night, I spent hours researching Texas property laws and noise ordinances, making sure I knew exactly where I stood. Everything confirmed what I already believed: I had every right to use my private lake as I pleased, as long as I wasn't breaking environmental or safety regulations. Tuesday evening, I took the jet ski out again, not just for fun, but to send a message that I wouldn't be bullied. As I pulled away from the shore, I spotted Victoria standing in her backyard, holding what looked like a notepad, timing me and possibly measuring noise levels with some device. She was literally documenting how I use my own property, like she was building a legal case. I waved at her as I passed along the shoreline, but she just scribbled furiously in her notebook. The whole thing was ridiculous. Yet, there was something almost comical about the absurdity of it all. Later that night, back at the house, I found a voicemail from someone at the county office. Victoria had apparently reported me for repeated violations of community noise standards. The county employee was polite but clearly confused, asking me to call back so they could understand the situation better. That's when I realized Victoria was escalating beyond angry letters, as she was dragging government agencies into this. As I got ready for bed, I made a decision: if Mrs. Knight wanted to play hardball, I'd learn everything I could about her and her history as a neighbor. I was done reacting, I was going on the offensive. The next morning, I called the county office and explained the situation. "Sir, if this is a private lake on private property, we don't actually have jurisdiction over recreational noise," the clerk said, "unless you're breaking specific decibel limits during restricted nighttime hours. There's really nothing we can do." She asked for my property details to close the complaint, and as I gave them, she said, "Mr. Walker, this is the third noise complaint we've received about your address this month. Are you sure this isn't just a neighbor dispute?" I assured her it was exactly that, and she promised to flag any future complaints from Victoria's address as possibly frivolous. That afternoon, things escalated further. While checking my mail, I noticed a car parked across the street, with someone snapping photos of my property. When I approached to investigate, the car sped off, but not before I got a clear look at the driver, Victoria Knight. She was now surveilling my property like a private investigator. The whole situation was becoming surreal, but I started seeing a pattern. Whenever her official complaints got dismissed, she simply moved up to the next level of harassment. I had a feeling her next move would involve law enforcement, and I wanted to be ready. That evening, I organized all my property documents, preparing for what I suspected would be her biggest escalation yet. On Wednesday morning, I did what I was good at from my software engineering days: online research. Victoria Knight's name popped up in more places than I expected, none of them flattering. Public records showed she'd been involved in at least 6 neighborhood disputes, including restraining orders and emotional distress claims. One story from last year caught my eye: a lawsuit against the HOA filed by a family whose children were banned from the community playground because Victoria deemed their play disruptive to the neighborhood atmosphere. The most interesting find came from property records near my ranch. In 2015, she tried to buy part of the lake from my grandfather and was flat out rejected. The rejection letter was still public. Mr. Walker has no intention of selling any part of his family ranch, particularly the lake property. Victoria's fixation on my lake wasn't new. She'd been eyeing this water for years. Thursday brought another phone call, this time from the state environmental office. Victoria had filed a complaint about possible water contamination from unauthorized motorized vehicles in a natural water body. The state worker explained they had to investigate all environmental complaints, but she sounded as doubtful as the county noise officer. "Ma'am, if this is a private lake on private property, we don't have jurisdiction unless there's evidence contamination is affecting public waterways," she said. I gave her my property details and deed number. She promised to close the complaint once they verified the lake's private status. After lunch, I decided to visit Olivia again to see what else she could tell me about Victoria's past in the area. "She moved here about 6 years ago with her ex-husband," Olivia said. "Right from the start, she was obsessed with your lake. She'd walk her property line every morning, staring across the water like she was plotting something." Olivia mentioned that Victoria had lost her job at the local bank due to conflicts with customers and co-workers. Her ex-husband once said that living with her felt like being under constant surveillance. She wanted to control everything. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had lost control of her marriage, her job, and most of her personal relationships, and who was now using her HOA position to control whatever she could. Friday evening, as I was preparing for another peaceful weekend by the lake, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a local area code. "Mr. Walker," said an authoritative voice, "this is Deputy Nathaniel Gray with the County Sheriff's Department. We've received multiple reports of illegal activity on your property and need to schedule a time to investigate." My stomach dropped. Victoria had escalated to calling the actual police. "What kind of illegal activity?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The reports mention unauthorized use of community water resources and possible environmental violations," Deputy Gray replied. I explained that the lake was on my private property and that I had all the necessary documentation to prove it. He seemed surprised and asked me to repeat the property address twice. "Sir, if this is indeed private property, then we may have received false information," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "Would you be available tomorrow morning for us to verify property boundaries and resolve this matter?" I agreed to meet him at 10 a.m. Saturday, and he advised me to have all my property documents ready for inspection. After hanging up, I realized Victoria had just made a serious mistake. Filing false police reports is actually a crime, and she just created an official record of her harassment. As I thought about the best way to handle the police visit, I noticed Victoria standing at her fence line with what looked like a camera, taking pictures of my property. She was documenting everything, probably thinking she was building a case against me, But in reality, she was creating evidence of her own obsessive harassment. I decided to return the favor, pulling out my phone to snap a few pictures of her surveillance activity. When she saw me photographing her, she scurried back to her house. I couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow's police visit was going to be very interesting. I had a feeling Victoria Knight was about to learn the difference between HOA authority and actual legal authority. The evening before the police visit, I sat on my porch looking out at the lake, reflecting on how much my life had changed since moving to the ranch. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat from city life had turned into a battle for my basic property rights. But as I watched the sunset glimmer on the water that had belonged to my family for decades, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Victoria Knight might have intimidated her neighbors before, but she'd picked the wrong person this time. I had the law on my side, the paperwork to prove it, and the patience to see it through. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end of Victoria's harassment campaign, though neither of us knew just how dramatically things would unfold. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather and the perfect chance to settle this dispute once and for all. I gathered my deed, registration, and copies of her letter, so everything ready for Deputy Gray. At 9:45 a.m., I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and my folder, waiting. I could see Victoria standing at her kitchen window, obviously watching for the police car. She'd probably been up since dawn preparing her own presentation for the officers. At exactly 10 a.m., I heard the crunch of gravel as a patrol car rolled down my driveway. Deputy Nathaniel Gray stepped out of the vehicle and Victoria appeared at her property line almost immediately, carrying what looked like a thick folder of her own. Deputy Gray seemed like he'd seen plenty of neighbor disputes, so this was just another Saturday morning call to him. "Mr. Walker," Deputy Gray began, "I'm here to investigate reports of unauthorized watercraft use and possible environmental violations. Can you show me the area in question and provide documentation of your ownership?" I stood and gestured toward the lake, clearly visible from where we were standing. "Deputy, this is my private lake on my private ranch," I said, handing him my folder. "Everything you need to verify that is right here." While Deputy Gray reviewed my documents, Victoria approached with her own folder in what looked like a rehearsed speech. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said in her most authoritative tone, launching into a statement about shared resources and community standards. She handed Deputy Gray a stack of papers of photographs, what appeared to be noise level measurements, and several pages of typed complaints. The deputy looked back and forth between the lake and Victoria's house, clearly doing mental calculations on property lines and distances. He spent several minutes reviewing both sets of documents while Victoria continued to explain community standards and property values. When he finally looked up, he held my property deed, wearing a slightly puzzled expression. "Mrs. Knight," he said carefully, "according to this documentation, the lake is entirely on Mr. Walker's private property. The deed shows clear ownership dating back to 1987, more than 20 years before your HOA development." Victoria's confident expression faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Well, that may be what the paperwork says," she replied, "but we have community agreements about water usage and noise levels that affect everyone in the area." Deputy Gray spoke with a hint of amusement. "Ma'am, with all due respect, community agreements don't override private property rights. If Mr. Walker owns this lake, he can pretty much do whatever he wants with it, as long as he's not violating environmental laws or safety regulations." He turned to me and asked, "Do you have registration for your watercraft?" I pulled out my jet ski registration and insurance documents, all current and legal. "Everything checks out," Deputy Gray said. "This is private property, the watercraft is properly registered, and there don't appear to be any violations." Victoria wasn't ready to give up. "But surely there are noise ordinances that apply to everyone," she insisted. "The sound from that machine carries across the entire neighborhood and disrupts peaceful enjoyment of our properties," Deputy Gray said as he consulted a small notebook before looking back at Victoria. "Mrs. Knight, noise ordinances typically apply to activities occurring between residential properties and not recreational use on private land. Unless Mr. Walker is violating specific decibel limits during restricted hours, there's no violation here." He paused and fixed Victoria with a stern gaze. "However, Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor offense. I strongly advise you to verify your facts before making future complaints. As Deputy Gray prepared to leave, he pulled me aside. "Mr. Walker, I've been in this job for 5 years, and this is one of the more unusual calls I've responded to," he said with a grin. "I've never had someone call the police to report illegal activity on someone else's private property. You might want to document any future harassment from your neighbor just in case this escalates," he added, handing me his business card. "If she continues to file false reports, it becomes a pattern we can actually take action on." As the patrol car drove away, I noticed Victoria standing at her fence line, watching it leave with a shocked and angry expression. The friendly neighbor mask had completely dropped, and for the first time, I saw the real Victoria Knight, someone who couldn't accept losing control over my property. That evening, while enjoying a celebratory jet ski ride around my lake, I realized Victoria's escalation to law enforcement had backfired spectacularly. Not only had the police confirmed my property rights, but they'd also created an official record of her false reporting. Deputy Gray's advice about documenting future harassment was sound, so I decided to start keeping a detailed log of Victoria's activities. As I pulled my jet ski back to shore, I saw her standing at her kitchen window, watching me through binoculars. Clearly, she wasn't finished yet, and something told me her next move would be even more desperate than calling the police. I had no idea how right I was about that prediction. Over the next few days, Victoria's behavior grew more erratic and obsessive. She walked the property line multiple times each day, taking photos from every angle, and even tried measuring the distance from the lake to her house with a tape measure. It was like watching someone slowly lose their grip on reality, and I knew a final confrontation was looming. Sunday morning brought a brief calm to my ranch, but I knew it wouldn't last. Victoria had been humiliated in front of the police, and someone like her wouldn't accept defeat quietly. I spent the morning doing routine maintenance, keeping an eye on both the lake and Victoria's house. Around noon, I saw her walking along our shared property line with a tape measure and a notebook, clearly hunting for some technicality to challenge my lake access. I called Deputy Gray. He wasn't surprised. Another call from Victoria. He sighed. "Mr. Walker, I'm not surprised to hear from you," Deputy Gray said when he answered. "Mrs. Knight called dispatch again last night, claiming you were operating your jet ski after dark in violation of some made-up ordinance. The dispatcher told her we wouldn't respond without evidence of an actual crime." He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Between you and me, we've had more calls from Mrs. Knight in the past month than we usually get from the entire neighborhood in a year. She's becoming what we call a frequent flyer, and not in a good way." Deputy Gray's tone was friendly but professional, and I could tell he genuinely wanted to help me through this. Monday brought another escalation in Victoria's campaign against my lake activities. This time, she contacted someone at the State Environmental Protection Office, claiming my jet ski was causing erosion and destroying habitat in a sensitive wetland. The state inspector who called sounded tired and annoyed, like he dealt with similar nuisance complaints before. "Sir, we're required to investigate all environmental reports," he explained, "but based on the property information you've provided, this appears to be a private lake on private land with no connection to public waterways. Unless you're dumping chemicals or causing downstream contamination, there's nothing for us to regulate here." Tuesday morning brought a visit from the state environmental inspector. He checked water quality, erosion, and my jet ski, and gave his verdict: one of the cleanest lakes he'd ever seen. When I told him about Victoria's harassment campaign, he shook his head sympathetically. "We get about 50 false environmental reports a year from people trying to use our agency to settle personal disputes. It's a waste of taxpayer resources, and frankly, it's annoying as hell." Wednesday evening brought the most surreal moment yet. I was grilling dinner on my back porch when I noticed Victoria setting up what looked like a tripod and camera at the edge of her property, aimed directly at my lake. She was now documenting my activities with professional equipment, like some kind of surveillance operation. I decided it had gone far enough and walked over to the property line to confront her. "Mrs. Knight," I called out, "can we talk for a minute about all this?" She looked up from her camera, her expression a mix of determination and desperation. "I'm documenting ongoing violations of community peace and environmental standards," she announced, as if reading from a script. "Victoria," I said, using her first name deliberately, "there are no violations." The police confirmed it. The state environmental inspector confirmed it. "This is my private property, and I have every right to use it as I please." She stood and faced me directly, genuinely upset at losing control of the situation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "I've worked too hard to build a peaceful community here. I won't let one selfish person destroy everything we've accomplished." It was clear the conversation wasn't going to be productive, so deciding to try a different approach, I said, "Mrs. Knight, what if we agree on specific times for me to use the jet ski? Maybe weekends only, or just weekend afternoons?" Victoria's response surprised me with how intense it was. "No," she snapped, "that lake should be quiet all the time. It's supposed to be a natural, peaceful space and not some noisy playground for your toys." At that moment, I realized this wasn't really about noise or community standards. Victoria wanted total control over everything she could see from her property, including my lake. There was no room for compromise because she fundamentally believed she had authority over land she didn't own. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I replied, "but this is my property and my lake. I'll keep using it responsibly, just like I always have." As I turned to leave, I heard her call after me, "We'll see about that." Thursday morning brought what I hoped would be the final escalation in Victoria's harassment campaign. I was checking my mail when I heard sirens and saw Deputy Gray's patrol car speeding down my driveway. My heart sank. I knew Victoria had made another false report, but this time it sounded like she'd claimed it was an emergency. Deputy Gray stepped out, clearly unhappy about being called out again. "Mr. Walker," he called, "we received a report of threats and intimidation. Mrs. Knight claims you approached her property last night and made threatening statements." My stomach dropped. Victoria had taken things further, making false accusations against my character. "Deputy Gray, I did speak with Mrs. Knight last evening," I said carefully, "but it was a civil conversation, trying to find a compromise. I never made any threats or intimidating statements." I spotted Victoria standing at her fence line, apparently ready to share her side. Deputy Gray pulled out a small notebook and asked me to describe exactly what happened. I recounted our discussion about setting specific jet ski times and Victoria's angry refusal to consider any compromise. His expression shifted from professional concern to clear skepticism. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "would you mind if I took another look at your property deed? I want to make sure I have all the facts straight for my report." I went inside and retrieved my property documents, this time including the detailed timeline of Victoria's harassment I'd been keeping. Deputy Gray spent several minutes reviewing everything while Victoria waited anxiously at her property line. When he finished, he looked up with a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Mr. Walker, let me make sure I understand this right," he said. "Mrs. Knight has been filing complaints about your use of a lake that's entirely on your private property, a land you've owned since before her neighborhood even existed." I nodded. He continued, "And now she's claiming you threatened her when you tried to offer a compromise about when you'd use your own lake." The absurdity of it all was clearly sinking in. After reviewing the evidence, Deputy Gray gave me his conclusion. "Mr. Walker, based on my investigation, there's no evidence that any threats were made. And frankly, Mrs. Knight's story doesn't add up, given the property ownership." He paused and glanced at Victoria still standing by her fence. "That said, this is the fourth false report we've received from Mrs. Knight in 2 weeks, and that's becoming a pattern we need to address." I felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. It sounded like Victoria's harassment campaign was about to backfire seriously. Little did I know the next 24 hours would bring the most dramatic ending to this ridiculous saga, and Deputy Gray would get the biggest laugh of his law enforcement career. Friday morning, I woke up feeling determined. Victoria's false police reports had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Deputy Gray's warning about documenting her behavior gave me an idea. If she wanted to make this public, I was going to make it very public. I spent the morning at the hardware store gathering materials for what I was already calling my public education campaign. By noon, I had everything I needed to turn my property deed into a neighborhood teaching Tula, and honestly, I was looking forward to Victoria's reaction. I made a huge sign that read, Perman Rancho Lake HOA Free Zone below it. I posted a detailed timeline of Victoria's antics. I mounted the sign on a sturdy post right at my property line, where anyone driving by could see it clearly. The sign also included a smaller notice, property boundaries verified by county records, did on file. It was professional, factual and guaranteed to irritate Victorianite. As I installed the sign, I noticed her watching from her kitchen window. I gave her a friendly wave, and I saw her binoculars come out. The real masterstroke came next. I decided to invite my neighbors over for an informal barbecue and a discussion about property rights. I put flyers in mailboxes all around the area, including homes inside Victoria's HOA, inviting everyone to learn about local property historia and enjoy some good food. Olivia Harrington was the first to respond positively, followed by several families from both inside and outside the HOA community. Even some of Victoria's immediate neighbors showed interest. Saturday afternoon brought perfect weather for the gathering. About 15 people showed up, including families with kids who were fascinated by the jet ski and excited about the possibility of swimming in the lake. Had everyone excited, especially the kids. I had prepared a simple presentation about property rights and the history of the ranch. The highlight was when I showed the original deed from 1987 alongside current photos of Victoria's house, proving the lake had been private property decades before her neighborhood even existed. Olivia spoke up, asking the question on everyone's mind. So, Mrs. Knight has been filing false complaints about activities on your private property? When I confirmed this and showed the timeline of her harassment, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. These folks had lived under Victoria's authoritarian HOA leadership for years. Many had their own stories about her unreasonable demands and controlling ways. She tried to fine us for having the wrong color mailbox, one neighbor said. She demanded we take down our kids' playset because it was visible from her kitchen window. Another added, it was clear the community was ready for Victorianite to face some consequences. Just as I was explaining Victoria's pattern of false police reports, she appeared at the edge of my property. She marched across my lawn like she owned the place, clutching what looked like a legal document and wearing her most authoritative scowl. This gathering is a violation of HOA community standards, she announced loudly to the crowd. I'm ordering everyone to disperse immediately. The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear birds chirping by the lake. Then Olivia started laughing, followed by several others, until the whole group was chuckling at Victoria's presumption that she had authority over my private property and my invited guests. Mrs. Knight, I said as politely as I could, this is my private property, and these are my invited guests. You have no authority here whatsoever. I held up my property deed for everyone to see. This document gives me the right to use my land however I choose, including hosting barbecues, operating my jet ski, and educating my neighbors about property rights. Victoria's face turned bright red with frustration and embarrassment. We'll see about that, she snapped, pulling out her cell phone. I'm calling the police right now to report this illegal gathering and your continued harassment of HOA residents. People in the crowd exchanged knowing glances. It was clear they realized they were witnessing Victorianite's final meltdown in real time. True to her word, Victoria dialed 911 right there, claiming I was hosting an illegal assembly on disputed property and harassing HOA members. What she didn't know was that Deputy Gray had already flagged her number in their system as a repeat false reporter. The dispatcher was tired of her constant complaints. While we waited for the police, my neighbors kept enjoying the barbecue and asking questions about property law and HOA authority. Victoria stood off to the side like an unwelcome party crasher, furiously typing notes on her phone and snapping pictures of my guests. When the patrol car finally arrived about 20 minutes later, Deputy Gray stepped out wearing an expression that mixed professional duty with obvious personal amusement. He was about to get the biggest laugh of his law enforcement career, and Victorianite was about to learn a hard lesson about the difference between HOA authority and real legal power. Deputy Nathaniel Gray approached the group, and I could tell right away his attitude was different from previous visits. Instead of responding to another of Victoria's emergency calls, he was here on a different mission. Mr. Walker, he called out as he walked toward us. "I need to speak with you and Mrs. Knight about an ongoing investigation." Victoria stepped forward, looking confident, clearly expecting the police to arrest me for some made-up crime. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly," she said in her most commanding voice. "This man has been harassing HOA residents and hosting illegal gatherings on disputed property." Deputy Gray gave her a neutral but privately amused look. "Actually, Mrs. Knight," he said, "I'm not here about Mr. Walker's barbecue, which is perfectly legal on his private property. I'm here because our department has completed an investigation into multiple false police reports filed from your address." Victoria's confident expression faltered. "Over the past 6 weeks, you've filed 8 separate complaints about activities on Mr. Walker's property and every single one has been proven false or misleading. Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor offense in this county, and we take it very seriously." The crowd fell silent, sensing they were about to witness something significant. Victoria looked around nervously, clearly not expecting this. Deputy Gray pulled out his notebook and continued while my neighbors listened intently. "Mrs. Knight, you've reported unauthorized water vehicle use on public property of false, because the lake is private. You've reported environmental violations of false. The state inspector found no violations. You've reported noise ordinance violations of false, because recreational activities on private property don't violate noise laws. And most seriously, you've reported threats and intimidation, which our investigation shows never happened." With each accusation he listed, Victoria seemed to shrink, and several of her own HOA neighbors shook their heads in disbelief at the extent of her false reporting. But more importantly, Deputy Gray said, "I need to see that property deed one more time for our official report, because Mrs. Knight keeps mentioning community property and public water features." I handed him my deed folder, which now included all the documentation I'd gathered over the past few weeks. As he opened it and read the property description aloud, I saw his shoulders begin to shake with suppressed laughter. "She filed reports about a private lake that's been in your family since 1987, he chuckled, wiping tears from his eyes. The deputy's professional composure finally broke, and he burst out laughing. "Ma'am, you've been calling the police to complain about a man jet skiing on his own private lake." The absurdity of the situation hit everyone at once, and most of my neighbors joined in the laughter. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, Deputy Gray continued, still chuckling, "and this is the first time someone's reported a crime that's just a property owner using his land legally." Victoria stood there, mortified as the reality finally sank in. She'd spent weeks harassing me and filing false police reports about activities that were completely legal on my own land. "Mrs. Knight," Deputy Gray said, his tone turning serious again, "you're being cited for filing false police reports. That carries a fine of up to $500 per incident. You're also being formally warned about harassment. Any future false reports will result in misdemeanor charges and possibly jail time." He handed her a citation and added, "Additionally, you are legally prohibited from contacting Mr. Walker or entering his property for any reason. If you have legitimate concerns about noise or environmental issues, you need to contact the appropriate agencies directly and not the police." Victoria took the citation with trembling hands, clearly realizing that her harassment campaign had not only failed but now had serious legal consequences for her. As Deputy Gray prepared to leave, he pulled me aside with a big grin. "Mr. Walker, I've got to tell you, this case is going to be legendary at our station," he said, still chuckling. "We deal with a lot of neighbor disputes, but I've never seen anyone work so hard to get themselves in trouble over something so perfectly legal. You handled this perfectly. You documented everything, stayed within your rights, and let her dig her own hole." He glanced back at Victoria, who was slowly walking toward her house with her head down. "Between you and me, we've been getting complaints about Mrs. Knight's home management from other residents for months. This citation might be just the push the community needs to make some changes." As the patrol car drove away, the atmosphere at the barbecue became noticeably lighter and more festive. Olivia approached me with a proposal I hadn't expected. "Lucas, several of us have been talking," she said. "We think it's time for a change in HOA leadership. Would you be willing to come to our next emergency meeting and help us understand property rights and community law? I think the whole neighborhood could really benefit from someone who knows what they're talking about. I agreed, realizing Victoria's harassment had unintentionally brought the community together against her authoritarian style. Over the next few weeks, changes swept through the neighborhood. Victoria Knight was overwhelmingly voted out as HOA president, with Olivia Harrington winning the election to replace her. The new HOA board quickly rescinded most of Victoria's excessive rule, including restrictions on children's play equipment and mailbox colors. Victoria put her house up for sale within a month. Unable to face the daily humiliation of living next to the lake she tried so hard to control, the for sale sign on her lawn became a symbol of justice for everyone who had suffered under her petty tyranny. The best part? My weekend jet ski rides turned into a neighborhood tradition. Olivia's new HOA policies explicitly recognized private property rights, and several families even asked if their kids could occasionally swim and fish in the lake. My private ranch lake became a community asset in the best possible way through mutual respect and voluntary cooperation, not authoritarian control. Every time I see Deputy Gray driving through the neighborhood, he waves and grins, and I know he's still telling the story of the HOA president who called the police to report crimes that consisted entirely of a man using his own property legally. And that's the story of how a simple property deed made a deputy laugh until tears came to his eyes. How an HOA president learned a costly lesson about property boundaries, and why sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to let them defeat themselves through their own unreasonable behavior. The lake remains as beautiful as ever, the jet ski runs perfectly, and the private ranch lake sign has become a beloved neighborhood landmark, reminding everyone about the importance of respecting property rights and treating neighbors with basic human decency. Sometimes justice comes through legal consequences, and sometimes it comes from a law enforcement officer laughing at the sheer absurdity of someone's overreach. In Victoria Knight's case, she got BOTA, and the entire community is better off because of it. From all of us here at HOA Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.